See if I can unmute myself. Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing well. It's great to be back with you after last week's little fiasco where Facebook was not connecting for whatever reason over and over and over again. It was quite annoying. And so it's great to see everybody. I see people from West Virginia, and then I see, Dalton, Georgia. Absolutely wonderful to have you all with us tonight as we dive into quite a relevant topic and somewhat also controversial. I can say that. In fact, I do need to note this real quick. And hey, from Alabama, great to see you guys too. I do need to note that tonight's topic is sensitive in nature. It's definitely one that has a lot of background to it and a lot of depth to it, but it also is one that can be very touchy for those who have dealt with this situation in some form or fashion, or just the nature of gender identity in general. Deals with a lot of sexuality, deals with a lot of topics that deal with sexuality, and so I'm just kind of giving that forewarning ahead of time that there will be some terminologies and some things that I will explain and give evidence for as to where this came from. For us to be able to do it justice, that may be a little bit more than what you may be used to, especially in a setting that would be, if there was, believers or Christians in some ways, definitely outside the norm for a quote-unquote Bible class, even though this study is not necessarily a Bible class nearly as much as it is looking at culturally relevant topics from a Christian perspective. And so I do want to just forewarn you on that one, let everybody know ahead of time that that is the case, especially if you're just tuning in right now. But at the same time, I'm very excited about being able to have this discussion. This is one I've spent a lot of time praying about, a lot of time making sure that I've done my research along the way, especially with as prevalent as this discussion has now become in our culture, in our schools, in our society along the way. And it's definitely one that is weighs heavy on a lot of people's hearts. And so I can say from my own self that this topic is not purely academic for me. I do and have worked with many teenagers and college students through the years that have struggled with both gender dysphoria or made choices and the rest about their gender identity. There's quite a few different things that go into that, but that is a reality. That is something that I've had to deal with across the board with quite a few different individuals, and it's never easy, not at any point in time, but it is a reality of our modern world. That's just kind of the way that it is. And it's definitely something I wanted to spend some time on, and so I'm glad that I didn't try to force it last week where it ended up being just cutting in and out all the time. So instead, I figured I'd give it some time and to do the best that we can. So grateful for all of you that are tuning in each week and those that are watching after. I'm always shocked that everybody keeps showing up, not just for the lives, but also after the fact to watch them. I'm grateful for your continued presence in what we're doing in this rabbit hole study. It's been truly fun for me to get these things and to get these topics and do the study. I like the academic study of it. And at the same time, I'm still shocked everybody shows up every week, but I am grateful for your presence. So let's dive in. And so I'll ask you in the comments here as I'm pulling up my notes and the rest, I'll ask this. When you hear the word gender identity, what comes to mind? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? You can put it in the chat, let us know. What is it that jumps out to you? What's the concept, the notion that comes to play when you hear the term gender identity? Is it something that others deal with? Is it something that you've only heard in passing? Or is it just a very confusing concept that seems to be just bantered about? What is it that you hear when you hear the words gender identity? So we'll see what you all, kind of where everyone's at from this standpoint as to what you hear or see or think when you hear gender identity. Okay. And as you guys are writing or putting something on there, hopefully, even if you're watching this after the fact, you can do it at the same time. That's one of the beauties of this, is because we can go back and have the discussions at a later time. I will go ahead and note this. Gender identity is a fairly recent terminology. it's not one that's been around for a long period of time. In fact, it is predominantly been since the 1950s, 1960s. And a lot of people don't seem to realize that. They think that it's just a term that's been used for a long period of time because it's often associated with the concept of working with people who deal with, the word escaped. The intersex individuals, people who are born at times with multiple sex organs, or they're born with both male and female genitalia, things of that nature. So we assume at times that that's what's being referenced there, is this premise of gender identity. But gender identity in and of itself is a modern terminology. In fact, it only goes back to the 1950s, 1960s. And so I'm going to introduce you to, in fact, what would be the man for the study of gender identity, the study of from a psychological perspective, and it's a fascinating thing to be able to actually note this. So, all right, so I see Emmy wrote, "What else will my grandchildren be exposed to? It seems God is becoming obsolete." Yes, believe me, this is a sad reality of where we are right now, that this type of stuff, and what's really going to make it worse is what I'm going to share with you tonight, is where all this stems from. So I'll introduce you to a character by the name of Dr. John Money. Dr. John Money. He was born in 1921. You would think that he would have been around for a long time. He just died in 2006. And I see someone else. Let me see who it was that wrote that, so I can see all the comments here. Judy, okay, yeah, I said gender and sex are different. Maybe gender is when someone chooses their sex. Sure, okay, absolutely. So that's kind of where we're at with that. You're not far off on that premise. So John Money, Dr. John Money, he is from New Zealand originally, and his main field was psychology. He actually studied at the Victoria University in Wellington, and then he worked also, did a postgraduate work, I believe his PhD at Harvard University, one of my alma maters, but then ended up spending most of his time, he founded at Johns Hopkins University, with I think many of you know, or at least have heard of Johns Hopkins. He founded, in essence, the first ever really study and center for gender dysphoria, for gender identity and sexual orientation and gender roles. And so that was founded, I believe it was in the 1950s, late 1950s, which kind of brought about this whole entire concept of, can people be born in the wrong body? Now, Dr. John Money's main argument over and over and over again was that it was nature versus nurture, that no one technically was born male or female. Didn't matter your genitalia, the rest did not matter whatsoever. No one was born that everything was a social construct. So even these terminologies I'm using right now that you're like, man, I hear these all the time now, these all stem from Dr. John William Money. And there was this entire premise that gender was completely fluid. It's completely based off of the nurture that you receive. So children are not born with a specific sex. Doesn't even matter what their anatomy might show or might say, that gender dysphoria and gender identities and the rest are fluid. They're social constructs. They're made up by parents. So in essence, if when my daughter was born, and I could say when my daughter was born, I basically, her mother and I, through our actions and through who we are as individuals, we assigned to her that she was going to be a female, thus we treated her like a female, or like what society says a female should be. We expected certain things from her as a female and the rest, and thus that's why she is a female. Same thing for my son. Even though he was born male, at least from a sex perspective, that is not necessarily how he became that. In fact, he became that almost purely because of the social norms that we set before him, that we laid out and said, this is what boys like cars, and they like dinosaurs and the rest, and little girls like dolls and they like playing with Barbies and the rest. And so his argument was, all of this was a social construct, that culture dictated these things, and that's what he believed. And so much so that when he started the center at Johns Hopkins for gender identity and pediatrics and the rest, he wrote a lot of different books. In fact, he started the first ever the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1965. And that's when it started. And that might seem like, well, that was a long time ago, but if you think in the world of science, it's not that long ago. It's very, very recent. And that's where they actually began creating the concept of sexual behaviors unit. They did sex reassignment surgeries for the first time, so transvestites, transgenderism, and the rest started having a place within the medical field where, and I'm going to do my best to be honest about this and also not be overly critical, but experimentations, basically experimentations on what it would like to change a physical man into a woman because one identifies as a woman. So the types of surgeries and the rest, trying to figure out how to do it, what it would look like, how, like there was this aspect of, well, kind of a Kevorkian concept of just trial and error. Now, one of the key things about Dr. Money is that he was... he died, like I said, in 2006, and he died, a lot of his publications and stuff that we all still use today, and in fact are the number one advocates for a lot of the terminologies you'll even see on major websites, on a lot of the books that deal with transsexuals and transgenderism and the rest are major publications of Dr. Money. But if I were to ask you, how many of you have ever heard of Dr. Money, would you say yes, no, you've heard of him? How many of you have heard of Dr. Money at any point in time? So you can say, yes, never heard of him, or brand new to me, didn't know he existed, don't know anything about Dr. John Money. This is all new information to me. So you can let me know in the comments. Had you ever heard of Dr. John Money until I mentioned him? I'll be interested in seeing this. Okay, no, brand new. All right, so... candidly, I'm not really surprised by that. That doesn't really surprise me that this is kind of new for many people. He's kind of been hidden away for a couple of reasons that I'm now going to share with you. In fact, if you wanted to ever do some research on some things, I would recommend highly that you look up the name David Raymer. It's Reimer. David Raymer. He was born Bruce Peter Raymer in 1965. He was a Canadian man that was born male but raised as a girl following medical advice and intervention after a botched circumcision left him basically castrated. And not only was that the case, but he was a twin. He had a twin. And so both of he and his brother were going in for basic routine circumcisions that were going to happen because they were having some issues going to the bathroom as young children when they were 8-9 months old. And so they went in. The doctor at the time completely botched it. Instead of using a knife like would be typical, tried to do cauterization and literally burned it off. And it became a major issue. And so the parents of David Raymer didn't know really what to do. And a couple of months later, they came across a TV program in Canada where it was talking about this new Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in Baltimore, Maryland, and this Dr. John Money, and how everything was, he was doing all these wonderful new things and experiments trying to help people, and they thought this might be some way to help their child. Here they had twin boys. They were very excited about twin boys, and now one of them was left completely disfigured for basically the rest of his life, and trying to figure out what to do. And so his parents, which are named Janet and Ron Reimer, they were trying to figure out how to deal with this whole entire thing. They met up with him, and they convinced them in essence to raise him as a girl. And so they actually did a surgery before he was 2 years old to completely castrate him, completely as a child. And they never told his brother or him that he was a girl, that he was a boy born a boy. Instead, he was always, then from that reassignment surgery, in essence, that happened when he was under the age of 2, he was raised as a girl that they called Brenda. And so Brenda and his brother were raised that way. And they would go back periodically through the years to spend time with Dr. John Money, to actually meet him as a psychologist. And the boys, I call them the boys, but Brenda and his brother never actually knew why they were going to this psychologist. They just went and talked, because the one thing they told the parents you could never do, because this was going to be the grand example of Dr. John Money of showing nature versus nurture. This was going to be his grand example, that if you raised this boy as a girl without him ever knowing anything, that he would absolutely be able to prove his thesis, prove his idea that sex is not something that is genetic or gender-based, but it's an identity that is placed by social construct, by society, and the rest. And so they began, in essence, this great experiment unbeknownst to the boys, not knowing this. And the terrible part about this is that Brenda, as she was being raised, suffered terribly, always felt like she was a boy. In fact, pushed back consistently in the psychotherapy sessions and the rest with them, and they went over and over again trying to find this. And Dr. John Money was even pushing for eventually for them to have to construct, in essence, a vagina for him, which to make her even more of a female. Never telling him what this was, what was going on, why they wanted to do these surgeries. His parents were told that that they could not tell the boys at all in any way, shape, or form about this whole entire thing, about what this was all about, because that would ruin everything and it would cause great harm if all of that happened. And so they over and over again tried to work this through. And now here's where it gets a little odd and terrible, is because Brenda, who was born a boy and now is identifying as a girl, unbeknownst to her, unbeknownst to him. And you see, even the terminology becomes very problematic trying to remember all of it. And because of this, in all the sessions, he would push back all the time, going, no, I feel like I'm a boy. And Dr. Money would constantly try to push and encourage and try to, push them to understand that she was now a female and he was a male, and that they were different. And so he would talk to them as if they were different. And there are transcripts of all of these discussions, except for a few that are actually still bound by some type of privilege that's out there, hidden away in one of the universities that he worked with for like a certain amount of years or something of that nature. And so he started publishing these things called the John and Joan case until the twins were 13 years old. So Money was actively publishing his results of what he was, and it became very clear to the parents that something was not going right, because their daily experience with their son and daughter was not a success. In fact, it seemed to be horrific. It seemed to be going terrible. And the issues that Brenda was having on a daily, from the bullying to feeling like she was a boy, to wanting to play all the games that boys would play but not being able to go with them because the boys wouldn't want to play with the girl, and the girls didn't want to play all the boys' games. So there was bullying involved and all sorts of issues. And the identical twin, his name is Brian, they were also struggling with this because he loved his sister and was trying to figure out how this all could place itself out. So Money is actually still publishing pretty consistently his tracts and his articles and the rest on the John and Joan case, not specifically noting them. And as I noted a minute ago, there was an aspect where suddenly a few things started coming about where he got frustrated. Dr. Money started getting frustrated when she turned, 8 to 10 years old, because he really wanted her to have the surgery to change her fully to be able to create, in essence, a vagina for her and the rest. And he got frustrated when she said no, when she did not want those things. She did not want the surgery. She was healthy. She was happy. Why would she have to do this? And so he tried to make it clear to them that they were a boy and a girl, and that needed to be a girl, and he was a boy, and girls had this and boys had this. And so he would have them, and this is kind of the trigger warning concept here, he would have them in their private sessions strip down and act out sexual positions and the rest together as twins together. He denies this to this day. Brian and David, called now David, both 100% state that it happened unequivocally, and that it was a cause for major psychological stress for both of them through the years. It was a major problem and became a fairly significant thing. So by the time that Brenda turned 14, it became very clear that Dr. Money, in fact, in the last psychotherapy session with him, Brenda came out of it and told her parents, if you ever make me go back there again, I will commit suicide. And so they said, we're never going back to him again. We're never going to do this. And the parents seemed to have been oblivious to all of these other things that were happening on. They were oblivious. They thought Dr. Money was there to help them with their son/daughter. But in reality, he was using them as living guinea pigs to test out his theories. And the tragic thing that ultimately happened with this is the father took Brenda at 14 years old and went and told him that he was actually born a boy, told him everything that had happened. And Brenda at that moment said it was the most freeing moment of her life, realizing that all the things that she had felt, that she wasn't crazy, that she had always known she was a boy. And she could not get around that fact. And it was the most freeing thing that she had ever experienced. On the other side, the mother took their brother, Brian, to tell him at the same time. He just reacted the opposite. Just pure anger and vitriol and shame. And much of it, I believe, and others believe, is because of the sexualization of them together. He now realized that he, as a boy, had been doing things to another boy. Not only that, but his own brother. Whereas before, he had this sense that he had been helping his sister to work through things, but there was deep shame and regret, which actually led to him developing schizophrenia, medical schizophrenia. And so Brian ended up having all sorts of issues going forward, and they broke off from the Dr. Money completely, and everything kind of went back to quote-unquote normal. Brenda immediately began calling herself David. She actually stopped taking the estrogen and all the different things. She had a double mastectomy from the estrogen-induced breast that had been built out, in essence. And so she started living as a boy. It was the most freeing thing, she said, to be a boy. Now, what she had always known she was. I don't know if you can imagine, but just, it's hard for me to comprehend. But for him now, it was the most freeing thing to live his life as a boy the way he's always known he was, because of the even the societal pressures that he had led him to feeling something that he just knew wasn't right deep down inside. It just wasn't what he really was. And so this whole case kind of plays itself out. Well, fast forward a few years, and Brian and David now find out that Dr. Money is still publishing the articles about John and Joan as if it was a resounding success. As if everything had gone exactly the way that he had said. That gender identity was a social construct, that all the things that he had always said were real, that sex is completely determined based upon culture, it's not bound by the actual genitalia, that in fact this very premise, this statement, gender is a social construct, came from those papers, came from the John and Joan papers that were actually demonstrably false. But no one knew who they were. And so, even though he was struggling with Great Depression, Brian, the brother, and schizophrenia agreed. David convinced him to come forward with a documentary that they put out, and I believe it was in the year 2000, basically stating, we were John and Joan, and no, it was not a success. It was a horrific failure. Not only was it a horrific failure, but it messed up our lives. We are scarred beyond belief. We have all these issues with us, and you can't even comprehend it. And you would have thought that was it. The tragedy of this story is that Brian, a few years later, because of addictions and other things, ended up dying of a overdose of antidepressants. And about 2 years after that, David took a shotgun and killed himself. What's even more tragic based off of that is that, in fact, in the documentary, David ends the documentary by saying, what is it going to take people to wake up and realize that all of this concept is, not only is it fake, but it's going to kill people. Is it going to take someone putting a gun to their head and killing them before people will wake up? That's what he says on video. In fact, you can go and watch it on YouTube. I won't share it here tonight, but you can watch it on YouTube. And that's what he did. And he was 38 years old. It was in 2004. I remember seeing it. It was during my years in college where I remember hearing about it on the news. And the tragedy of the story of Brian and David Reimer and Dr. John Money and what he has done. Dr. John Money has continues, in fact, ended up winning 65 major scientific awards in his life, all sorts of stuff, and most of his writings, even though with the Reimer brothers and the rest discrediting this whole entire concept, it has become the norm. I mean, I just want you to think now, the terminologies and everything that I have noted, all of that is directly coming from the studies and the scientific papers and publishing of Dr. John Money. That's where it's coming from. So now when you think about gender ideology and you think about the social constructs, and when people say you can be born a boy but you can actually be a girl and you can be all of these different things over and over and over again, that's the cornerstone of the scientific premise of where all of that is coming from. Now, no one denies this. There's no one in the scientific community that denies that Dr. John Money and his writings, this is where it came from. What is now swept aside is now it's almost like we've accepted it as if it's true, because what often will be done is, well, maybe it didn't work for them, but have you met all these other people? Have you met all these other people who have transitioned? And our surgeries are a lot better, and everything's easier. And the problem with that is that, I say tragically in a lot of ways too, the science is not actually bearing it out. There are a lot of people who are transitioning back or trying to transition back. One of the films that I recommend, I'm not a big fan of any film that seems to have a mocking tone to it generically, and that's why I don't automatically recommend it, but I recommend it for the question that it poses. What is Matt Walsh's What is a Woman? Because of the conversations that he has directly with individuals, and also those who have transitioned and are detransitioning, the suicide rate for those who have transitioned is actually higher than for those who do not. I believe it's at 70%. And so when people talk about the fact that even denying that transgenderism was real or transsexuals are real or so forth, that it speaks violence, it causes violence, that's what they're referencing. They're referencing the fact this idea that any type of, or talking about this will cause violence. I disagree with that, and the reason why I believe is I think the violence stems from the fact that it's not actually solving any problems. So I do believe people struggle with both chemical imbalances of the brain and also struggle with the concept of gender dysphoria, where you feel like you're born in the wrong body and the rest. But we have now gotten, it's the only science medicine where the cure that is offered is acceptance of, in quote unquote, the disease. I don't really like that terminology because it's not a disease. It can be sometimes a mental illness, but other times it can be just a societal pressure. In fact, one of the things right now scientists are having to deal with is how in the world do you do like where there's so many kids are coming out as transgender, and that can't be the case based purely off of statistical models. It's far too high. So what it must actually be is that there are societal pressures, cultural pressures for people to become certain ways because they're going to be more accepted. It's called social proof. If you think back to our study on cults, we talked about social proof, that which is accepted or that which is not only accepted but celebrated needs to be joined in on, needs to be grabbed. And in fact, it's a way of making yourself feel or seem more than others. It's a way to stand out. And so the social proof of acceptance within gender ideology is massively high. And that's what we're seeing over and over again in our culture. You're seeing teenagers and children and the rest, and parents going, I'm being a good parent by letting my 3-year-old decide what they are and what they decide. And this has led into the concept of the very premise of the pronouns discussion. And again, I want to be very clear about all of this. I'm speaking of this from an academic perspective in a lot of ways. I never want us to forget the fact that we're talking about people with souls, and that everyone, no matter their struggle and where they're at in life in those ways, should be treated with love and compassion. And in fact, that's why I even say the concept with What is a Woman? It's a fantastic documentary concept, but I don't like at times the mocking tone that is often taken. Instead, I think there was a better way to do that, but it is what it is. But it does ask a question that in our culture right now seems like we're unwilling to answer it. And where is it coming from? It all stems from the work of Dr. John Money. Dr. John Money is the one who, it is his works and the rest, and I would argue were predominantly falsified. In fact, a lot of even his research assistants through the years refuse to release the notes from their studies and the rest, and everybody just sets it aside because now it's standard acceptance. It's accepted in our culture. This is the norm now. This is what it is, and you see this social proof of everybody trying to be like everyone else. It's the new cool thing. In the 90s, I remember there was a huge thing with people dressing up as like goth or things of that nature, and I don't want to equate that because I think this is far more tragic, but there was, you would have people going, I want to be different, and so I'm going to dress different, but then they would dress like, then somebody else would go, I want to be different too, so they would dress exactly like the other person. And that's the premise of social proof, is that you do that which makes you stand out while also claiming that you're just trying to fit in. And it's a weird concept that can play itself out. And I do believe we are seeing not only the over-sexualization of our children, the over-sexualization of people in general, but if you were to go back 30 years from now, even this conversation would seem just absurd. I mean, just absurd. But we live in a very different world now, a very different concept of what it means to be a man, to be a woman. We have the attacks on masculinity. In fact, masculinity now is inherently toxic based off of the terminologies that are used. Femininity is actually unbelievably under attack. The very premise of being feminine, of being female, is under attack in ways like it's never been before. Because we've lost the very identity, because gender and sexuality has become completely irrelevant. In fact, if gender is a social construct, then why in the world would it matter if you're a woman? Why would it matter if you're a man? So you can't blame the man or blame the woman for all the ills of society if those things are total social constructs. If they're made up, if they're irrelevant. And you see, all of society crashes together when illogical, irrational concepts start becoming the norm by which we're trying to build things on. And it's also one of the reasons why I'm not terribly worried about this outside of the horrible concepts and consequences of those who deal with transgenderism, who are dealing with gender dysphoria, who are dealing with all these things. My heart breaks every day when I meet and I see people who are struggling through these concepts and struggling with these identities, and the parents that are buying into it. But ultimately, it will be found out for what it is. It's an empty well. There is no peace to be found in it, and it's going to end up being, hopefully, in the annals of time, will be set aside as a terrible moment in history, much in the same way that eugenics and some of the other things that we found out when we tested on individuals. Like, I hope that this falls away in a way that we've never seen before, but right now we're in the midst of it. We're right smack dab in the middle, and it's painful to watch, and it's painful to see individuals that you might love and that you might care for, that are struggling, that are hurting, or who have bought into this ideology, who have bought into these premises, these ideas, that somehow their identity is fluid, that they were made imperfect, that they were made in the wrong body. And this is where I'll turn around and say, God does not make junk. I do believe that because of the fall of man, if you go back to Genesis, You will see that the fall of man and from the entrance of death, that when death came into the world, we have a genetic breakdown that has changed through time. We have cancers, and you can inherit certain genetic traits as opposed to others. There's all sorts of different stuff that come along that I know affect us in ways that will affect me in a different way than it might affect someone else. I don't struggle with gender dysphoria, but I do know those who do. And I hurt for them. And I'm not going to sit here and act like my struggles are worse than theirs or better than theirs or any of those things in life. But we do inherit genetic traits that come down from our family lines, from things that are outside of our control. I also do not believe in any way, shape, or form that ultimately that changes at all what God made us and what He expects from us. That God has called us to purpose in this life. And that no matter how much struggle we may have in this life, whether it's physical, whether it's gender dysphoria, whether it's those types of things, what I will note is that the first second in eternity will be worth every second of the pain and suffering one might struggle in this world. The first second will be worth it all. And that's hard for us to comprehend at times because this world seems like it lasts so long, but I tell you, it doesn't. In fact, Scripture over and over again says it's but a mist. It's just but a moment. And so when it all comes down to it, with the heartbreaking nature of what we've discussed tonight and what we've talked about, you just need to remember that there, and this is what I do remind my friends who struggle with gender dysphoria, transgenderism, same-sex attraction, a lot of different things. I'll just say this, that God loves them. Not only does God love them, but God has a plan for them beyond just the struggles from within. And I do want to also note, sexual sin is sexual sin for everyone. It's not just same-sex or others. Sexual sin is sexual sin for everyone. Sexual sin outside of the bonds of the marriage that God designed sexuality for is sin. And thus, I don't have to qualify it by saying same-sex or opposite sex or heterosexual. I don't have to qualify it. I can just say sin is sin outside of the confines of what God has in mind for it. When it comes to your own sexuality and the rest, that's one of those things that you have to be careful for. You have to guard your heart and understand that which you believe and that which you buy into will directly affect how you view the world. So I want to share with you all before I close out tonight, and feel free if you have any questions at any time, something that you feel free to ask that in the chat. But I want to share a website with you real quick. This is a screenshot from what's called the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a very well-known LGBTQ plus website and the rest that's used out there. But I took this screenshot for when you first get there. Do you notice this? It says, press the escape button 3 times to quickly leave our site. Got it. Do you any ideas of what this might be about? Any ideas why this might pop up when you first get to the website? I'll be interested if I've got some quick learners out there as to why this pops up. We'll see if anybody in the chat knows. Okay, no, all right. All right, well, I'll give you the insight then. It's so that children who have questions, but they don't want their parents to know, have a very quick way of minimizing or closing out a website without their parents knowing. And it does not show up, as Kelly noted, in your search history. I don't know about you, but that instantly sets up red flags. I typically go, I have questions when a site does this type of thing. But within the site itself, and I'll show this here to you, you can see the understanding, there are a lot of different ways someone can express their gender identity. So this is one where if you want to go learn more about different things, but that is the reason why they have that at the front of the website, just so you know. It's a quick exit for kids and the rest. So yes, a lot of red flags there. And it gives a lot of different things here, and candidly, I will note this. Dr. John Money, historically, is viewed as not only having had a lot of issues, but he was also because of his understanding or the way he viewed sexuality as being interchangeable, as it being cultural and so forth, he also viewed pedophilia as being something that was a social construct too, that it was just the over-sexualization of conduct between parents and children, that it was not inherently wrong, it was something that should be accepted in the rest. Now, here's the slippery slope argument that you could make. Absolutely. In fact, over and over now, we're seeing more and more the concept of pedophilia becoming even normalized. Recently, they've actually tried to change the terminology in the Handbook of Science from pedophilia to minor attracted persons, MAPS, as they want to be referred to now, because pedophilia has such a negative context to it, and you don't want people to view people negatively, and so that's the reason why you have to change the word. It wouldn't be fair to them to be labeled pedophiles, so thus we call them minor attracted persons. All of this stems from the studies of Dr. John Money, and as I noted, if you want to do a more deep dive, you can look at the tragedy of David and Brian Reimer, Reimer, and the rest. I know this was a subject that was brought up a few times that when people ask me to deal with it, and so I have. And it's a tough one to deal with. Emotionally, it's a lot to try to process through all of this, because this isn't going away. In fact, I think it's coming to a head right now. We're seeing a culture war in some states, in Florida and others, not just as we noted in the first week with critical race theory or intersectionality, but also with gender identity and gender constructs. All of these things are coming to a head in a fairly significant way in our culture, and I do believe these are the culture wars that need to be won. And I'm not talking just purely from a Christian perspective, but from a logical and philosophical perspective for the betterment of humankind, of humanity on the whole. And the good part about this that I can say is this is not really accepted in most places outside of academia in the first world, and it's coming out of our universities, and it's coming out of a lot of different places. But if you go to Africa, if you go to places in India and the rest, this is not the normalized expectation or understanding of sexuality. These are very modern constructs that are making their way through culture, and it's my hope that they will die a terrible death. That this academic study will find itself in the trash bins of histories as a tragedy of epic proportions, but not one that will continue on beyond what we have right now and what we see right now in our world. So, that's what I have for you tonight. If you have any questions, if you have any thoughts, if you have anything, please add them to the chat. If this has made you think about anything, or let me just say this, if you're struggling, if you yourself are struggling with these, if you've got friends that are struggling with it and you want to know possibly how to broach the subject or how to communicate with them, always know that we're here for you. I'd love to help you out in any way I can. Send me a message through Facebook or the rest. But let me also close out by saying I love you guys. Always do everything in love. Make sure that people know we have to stop being the people that seem to be against everything, but instead be the people who have answers. Because we have a God who provides salvation. We have a God who loves us enough that in our sin He sent His Son that He might take our place on the cross. And with that in mind, every person that we have out there, we need to look in the same way, that we are a beggar who found bread, who knows how to help other beggars find bread. And that's really where we're at. So never forget to love everyone. Never forget to always go out of your way to support others. And if you have questions, please reach out to myself or to others. And if we can help you and support you in any way, we want to do that. With that in mind, can I fix this to where you can share it on our Facebook page? Yes, I can. I'm planning on downloading all these. I just haven't had a chance to yet, and then making them available where they can be shared outside of the group. I'll be more than happy to do that here, so I appreciate that question. I'll see if I can get to that sometime soon. With that in mind, next week, new topic. I don't know what it is off the top of my head. I'm going to start doing research here in a little bit, and so I will post in the group. I will also post some links about tonight's discussion, some articles and others, Dr. John Money and others, so you can see, and hopefully you can actually look and see if I'm being fair. If I'm being fair with the information, don't always just assume I got it all right. Please feel free to add. Let me know what else you find. I'd love to know what you all find. If you find any good articles and the rest, love to know that. If not, I will see you all next. In fact, actually, it will not be next Thursday night. It will be 2 weeks from now, because next Thursday night I will be driving down to Gatlinburg, Tennessee for the Challenge Youth Conference, CYC. I hope to see some of you there. Might be there, but I will be there for that weekend. So it'll be 2 weeks from tonight when we will be back together, and we'll dive into the next topic at that time. Thank you all. Love you all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.